Hey folks, welcome to my channel, Heresiarch UK. You can call me John or Tush, and welcome to my first video of this sort. This is it's kind of a commentary on Albert Camus' The Fall. It's less of a review, more of a selection of quotations that I found thought-provoking and the thoughts that resulted from them. I'm doing this for a few reasons. For those of you who've interacted with me on social media are aware that I'm quite open about the fact that I'm recovering from depression. One of the side effects is which has been that I struggle with reading. I simply lack the ability to focus for any significant period of time. By reading with a focus on picking out passages as I read, it enforced me to focus. And if I caught myself absent-mindedly flicking through pages, I had to go back and make sure I'd taken them in. Partially out of fear that I'd make a tit of myself in writing and recording this review, but also because I don't want to miss something that I could deem important. One of the other reasons is that I would like to talk about this sort of thing. I don't have that many friends in general, very few of whom are interested in philosophy to any significant extent, which isn't an indictment of their character. Obviously we share other interests. But as a desperately lonely soul who overthinks everything to oblivion, it would be nice to have some other voices echoing about my head to reinforce and chisel away at mine where appropriate. I wholly encourage anybody who watches this, who has an interest in Camus, to consider reading the book if you haven't already, and to talk about the things you found most salient, or things I say that you disagree with. Of course, reading the book isn't a prerequisite either. I'd be happy to give further context myself, or to try and relay the story. I don't intend to discuss the plot in much detail, other than to give this disclaimer. The book is entirely told from the perspective of Jean-Baptiste Clemence, a judge penitent, who introduces himself to the reader and proceeds to, over the course of several days, describe his life, his fall from grace, and where he finds himself now. His title, Judge Penitent, is descriptive of a man who, through judging himself and casting aside all material wealth, believes he is now capable of judging others, so through penitence he's gained the right or ability to judge others. His previous life as a lawyer allowed a lot of judgment, but very little judgment internally. An event occurs which leads him to a revelation, and in turn he changes that nature. What this means is that these aren't Camus' quotes directly. It seems important to note that they are all delivered by Jean-Baptiste. The entire book is written from the perspective of Jean-Baptiste. From the perspective of the reader hearing Jean-Baptiste. And as such, at times they represent quite extreme ideals and notions. So they're thought-provoking, but they're not to be taken at face value as treatises to be taken seriously. That makes this a forgiving book for me to begin my process with, because I don't have to match my wits with Albert Camus, and instead get to kind of put them up against a character who is assuredly imperfect, and not designed to be otherwise. So, I mean, with any luck, magically, a first quote will be appearing here any second now, while discussing his life as a lawyer and the lifestyle accompanying it, in which he had everything he wished to have, or so he thought. Jean-Baptiste says, "But you can already imagine my satisfaction. I enjoyed my own nature to the fullest, and we all know that there lies happiness, although to soothe one another mutually we occasionally pretend to condemn such joys as selfishness." This is something I find ceaselessly interesting, and a topic I often come back to when lost in my own thoughts. I think there's some truth in the notion that happiness involves being entirely at comfort with yourself. People talk about loving yourself before you can love others and all these things. But it's also hard to ignore the lie we often espouse that we aren't happy. Here it's claimed that it's to soothe one another. But I would argue that most people do it almost in an effort to raise themselves above criticism. By challenging your own happiness publicly, people are less inclined to make their own observations and challenge it themselves, since you're not laying claim to perfect happiness or bliss. I understand the necessity of this, but I think it's harmful to everyone involved. If you speak disingenuously about what you feel diminishes your happiness, you both avoid what would likely be valid criticism from others, but also your projected unhappiness skews other people's perception of their own. It's hard not to argue, for example, that those who often complain the most about their looks are those who look typically above average. Granted, that's a difficult average to measure. Similarly, those with intelligence most often bemoan their lack of intelligence. Now, the Dunning-Kruger effect may be playing a part in this, but I wonder if we overplay that slightly, potentially due to this unnamed phenomenon, this self-deprecation. In doing so, it deflects from your actual flaws, while also twisting the socially accepted definition of beauty or intelligence, or whatever your vice may be. I've always condemned my own intelligence as lacking, and if ever I felt confident in it, I would immediately label myself arrogant. Again, not entirely because of a desire to shield myself from valid criticism, since my issues were largely based in mental health, depression and anxiety, but in doing so I sold myself short. There's undoubtedly truth to that. I still struggle. Internally, I will often note that I'm being arrogant. I've been telling myself the entire time I've been recording this, because after all, nobody asked for this commentary. That surely is the definition of arrogance, to propose an opinion where nobody required it. But I'm allowing myself the confidence to talk with assuredness and not question myself repeatedly. I want to speak with some bluster, because the reality is I know my opinions aren't empty or without worth, and until I can speak them with some confidence, I may never find the forum in which they can actually have an impact. Further, in discussing the nature of happiness, of satisfaction and contentedness with life, Jean-Baptiste Clement says, indeed, wasn't that Eden, cher monsieur, no intermediary between life and me? And then, slightly further on again, familiar when it was appropriate, silent when necessary, capable of a free and easy manner as readily as of dignity, I was always in harmony. Again, I think the first quote speaks to confidence, understanding that you have a direct line with life, the ability to communicate directly with the people around you, to make your desires known, and to understand what is asked of you in return without an intermediary is surely a decent measure of happiness, or at least would likely lead to happiness. Again, the end of the second quote, always in harmony, reinforcing this point. I don't know if, in reality, anybody can truly reach that level of harmonious interfacing with other people, since by definition you're interacting with people who themselves aren't harmonious, and they therefore provide obstacles to your own free-flowing path. But as something to aspire to, I think it isn't without sense. I pride myself on an ability to talk to any generation, any class of person, and typically without losing what I consider my personality. I can navigate most conversations appropriately. Certainly something I've grown into. As a teenager, I would often befriend parents and authority figures, teachers or police officers, as easily, if not more so, than I could my peers, which I've always attributed to my ability to empathise. I understand with relative ease what different groups within society want from a conversation, and of course the simple truth that most just wish to be respected and have an interest shown in them, regardless of race, age, creed or class. And knowing that, I wasn't afraid. I was in harmony and able to speak freely. Another quote then, further on, it was not a matter, mind you, of the certainty I had of being more intelligent than everyone else. Besides, such certainty is of no consequence, because so many imbeciles share it. This is another quote that immediately brings Dunning-Kruger to mind. The first time I read this, it almost felt like compounded arrogance. The notion that Jean-Baptiste clearly considers himself above most, since he disregards so many as imbeciles, but fails to recognise this while trying to dissuade the reader of his presumed superiority. The more I thought about it, the more I began to see some truth to it. It's still difficult for me to ignore the arrogance inherent in believing this, but I think it's fair to say, personally, that I am reasonably intelligent, at least academically and in my manner of thought. And knowing that of myself, while also dismissing the implication that I'm special for thinking it, or being it, is a dichotomy I struggle with each day. I need to perhaps get a better grasp on my relative intelligence so I can better decide when to allow myself confidence or arrogance. This is something I've struggled with for a long time, and imagine I will continue to struggle with for a long time to come. A further quote again, I see that the declaration amazes you. Have you never suddenly needed understanding, help, friendship? Yes, of course. I have learned to be satisfied with understanding. It is found more readily, and besides, it is not binding. And then, halfway through the next paragraph, I believe. Friendship is less simple. It is long and hard to obtain, but when one has it, there is no getting rid of it. One simply has to cope with it. It's a very cynical view, perhaps, but I can't imagine many of us haven't had friends who clearly just want our understanding, our empathy, and our time, with no interest of committing to what might actually be considered a friendship in any real terms. I think being aware of this allows you to define those people, to categorise them. It's a metric or a yardstick by which to measure somebody's commitment to you and your loyalty. And if you recognise they seek only your understanding, you can react accordingly and provide it with expectation, or refuse it with prejudice. I've often dedicated far more time to others than they would ever consider dedicating to me. I pride myself on it as a virtue, a self-destructive virtue, which may well itself be part of why I do it. But recently, I've started to do so knowingly, without hope or desire of it being returned. In some cases, I still find it difficult to not get upset when the other person detaches or refuses to extend to me even a fraction of the courtesy I extend to them. But for the most part, I feel I'm getting better at making this distinction, and, well, still offering more than I might receive, doing so while maintaining a hand on the ripcord for my parachute should I need to immediately and without remorse protect myself from exhaustion or exasperation. I think I'm better able to navigate those relationships where I don't want to say that I'm being used, because I willingly offer more. I'm not doing it. Doing a good deed for the sake of the return diminishes the quality of the deed to an extent, and that's something I've always tried to kind of force myself to understand and accept, because I think that's the ideal way to behave. It's not entirely possible. Obviously, it's very upsetting when somebody misuses your time or misuses your energy and your empathy. But again, being able to remind myself that is what people want, and providing them it is not without virtue, and recognising that they're not like evil in any way by only wanting understanding and not committing to anything more is helping me more healthily approach those relationships, I think. Further on, when talking about the mundanity of life and how people, the quote, so something must happen, and that explains most human commitments. Something must happen, even loveless slavery, even war or death. Hooray then for funerals. I read this in a very personal regard, or I took a very personal thing away from this, and that is, personally at the moment, I'm struggling quite a bit with what is essentially a very slow transitional period. I'm undoing 17 plus years of damage, and as I've written here, the slow scrambling of my mind and self-worth. And the reality is, that can only take a long time to undo. It can't be an overnight process, it can't be quick. I want there to be events, milestones, and achievements that I can photograph and record and keep sight of, but the reality is most progress is invisible and painstakingly slow and incremental. It's natural for us to want there to be things. An interesting departure from Albert Camus. I used to joke that Hollyoaks was always either hosted to a funeral or a wedding, every time I saw it. I do feel the need to clarify that I never watched it personally, but in university I had housemates who did, so I would often see it while preparing dinner or chatting to them. And in hindsight, I think they ironically touch upon a very deep point, which is obviously in fiction, where we can author the timeline and create it, to our will and how we would like to see things. We want there to be constant commotion and momentum in one direction or another, happiness or sadness. Otherwise our time feels less valuable or unimportant. And that's obviously one of the most common arguments with soap operas, is the reason stuff's always happening is because you're not going to watch it when nothing's happening. Recognising this as part of the human condition and reconciling it with reality is, I think, an important part of my recovery. And I'm glad to have seen it reflected here, because it allows me to make the notion more corporeal in my head and give it form and figure. Before I would argue I was aware of it, but I struggled to materialise it and give it a realistic structure in my head. As an aside, I often find simple passages like this, or things said in passing in a conversation, can provide me with like a cathartic reduction of a complex thought, providing me an idiom or an ideological anchor from which I can build a more stable understanding of something. Anyway, a quote then that for some reason this really did knock me for a while. If pimps and thieves were invariably sentenced, all decent people would get to thinking they themselves were constantly innocent, cher monsieur. And in my opinion, that's what must be avoided above all, otherwise everything would just be a joke. I mean, this caught my attention for a few reasons, one of them being it punctuated the end of a chapter, which gave it more prominence in the flow of the prose. It's a common theme throughout the story that guilt and innocence are essentially relative terms. To indict one person of a crime is to ignore your own, or to diminish them by comparison and justify them as the lesser of the two. Leading back to the proverb, he who lives in a glass house shouldn't throw stones. What we tend to do is just pretend that our house isn't made of glass, or throw the stones through an open window and hope nobody notices that there's a structure around us too. This started off a particular chain of thought for me, which is in regards to social movements, so feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, things like this. We're at a point now where and the example I've gone for here is feminism, the minutiae of ingrained behaviours are being identified and challenged publicly, which is necessary. It's part of the slow grinding movement towards parity between the sexes. It's almost one of the last stages, I think. There are obvious disparities, like women not having the vote and not being allowed to drive in some countries, and having to cover their selves head to toe, and all these different things that are significant percentages of the disparity, of the inequality. And as you approach 40%, the last 10% is actually very difficult to identify, and you have to start looking for the really small things that sort of enforce that culture. 2 decades ago, these transgressions would have been unnoticed and, for lack of a better term, allowed. For example, there's a story recently about younger teenagers watching Friends for the first time in 2018, and they're shocked by how regressive and backwards it seems compared to modern standards. As the grander transgressions that back then were the focus of the movement have been shown to be definitively wrong for the majority of us. And as a result, the smaller transgressions have now become more prominent. So the sins of our past selves, or the sins of the previous generation, for example, have become grander in size because we no longer have the bigger ones to kind of compare them to. It's no longer... since you wouldn't see those more obvious transgressions regularly anymore because we kind of beat them out of society and made them disreputable, those smaller ones are now significant because there's nothing, they're not hiding the shadow of anything. As a result of this, when you're comparing figures from a century ago to today, it's almost impossible not to find them deplorable, and obviously failing by today's standards. And I don't want to excuse any form of ignorance or hatred, but I do wonder how much of an injustice we do by imposing our standards on people from, I say a bygone era, but it could be as simple as 10, 20 years ago. Everybody wants to believe that the topics they're most passionate about should be important to everyone, but the fact is they can't be, and not necessarily through madness. I see a lot of people saying that we shouldn't excuse older generations for their more ignorant views, because if they so chose, they could educate themselves. But really, it's not that simple. And while we should endeavour to explain to anybody who displays hatred or ignorance the error of their ways, to consider them inherently evil or guilty for not educating themselves is illogical to me. After all, I can't think of a single person I know who is savvy to every social movement currently ongoing. Similarly, I can't think of anybody with even a rudimentary knowledge of every topic of scientific importance, because the reality is people are involved in their own struggles, they have their own interests, and until given an opportunity to learn, it's foolhardy to label them an enemy or a harbinger of vitriol. As the quote goes, never attribute to malice what could just as easily be attributed to stupidity, essentially. I'm not entirely sure I connect these points eloquently enough, looking at what I've said, but if if I've not done so, just know that I've gotten there from the notion of guilt and innocence being relative terms, relative to others, relative to society as a whole, and therefore a product of their time. Their cultural context, and as such, is something we should be somewhat forgiving with, no matter how difficult it is to be forgiving in the face of potentially harmful views or opinions. And now for something completely different, thankfully, before I say something that'll get me into a lot of trouble. This is a very quaint quote. I enjoyed this one when I read it. I repeated it to the people I was going to visit as soon as I got there. You know what charm is? A way of getting the answer yes without having asked a clear question. It made me laugh. It's a very clever definition of charm. It's a very pragmatic definition of charm. It's one that really, to me, embodies the word. It really gives it like a character, anthropomorphizes it for me. And as someone who is constantly aware of the potential for me to manipulate others, given my vocabulary and my ability to kind of speak untruths into existence almost, this essentially for me is giving me a way of avoiding that behaviour. I can identify it. I know now that if somebody agrees with me and I've not actually asked them what it is I want from them, I'm likely being a little bit deceptive, or in my opinion, somehow improper. Yeah, so it's just something that it made me laugh, but then the more it kind of circled in my head, the more I realised that it was something I could take a very practical tool away from. Looking at the next quote, but the oath they swore to me liberated me while it bound them. This is a comment in regard to Jean-Baptiste's lovers, who he would convince to commit themselves to him, at which point he felt completely free to leave them, as he'd achieved their loyalty. His ego could rest knowing they'd willingly given themselves to him, and so he could leave without fear that he'd somehow come up short. I think this is a behaviour that's quite often seen in young men in particular, this notion that love is about ownership and power or control, and I've long been content in knowing that I really don't like it. But again, just as a remark, I find it quite salient in passing for modern society, and I think again it's something that I can use to measure my own behaviour and hopefully behave what I consider in a better manner as a result of. It was harder and more painful, on the other hand, to admit that I had enemies among people I hardly knew or didn't know at all. This comment on the fragility of ego and the impossibility of pleasing everybody and the foolishness in trying to, like even further, if you try to ascertain whether you succeeded, the amount of energy required, because you have to ask everybody, and then if they don't like you, do you have to make them like you? Again, it was just something that jumped out at me in passing. I don't really want to dissect this too much. I just think it's interesting to recognise and again dismiss that behaviour internally. Both in the sense that you can't please everybody, ain't worth trying, but even I get very anxious about silly things like taking up a lot of space because I'm quite a big guy. And obviously I don't want to do that because I don't want to cause a practical hindrance to anybody, but the reality is, if I'm not causing that much trouble by sitting somewhere, I shouldn't give a monkeys about people who get upset about it, because what am I going to do? There's nothing, like, I shouldn't be impacting my own life that bad in the hope that I can stop other people from disliking me, because the reality is people are always going to dislike me, and if that's the reason they dislike me, more pity them, to be honest. Yeah, anyway. The next quote. Your successes and happiness are forgiven you only if you generously consent to share them, but to be happy it is essential not to be too concerned with others. Consequently, there is no escape, happy and judged, or absolved and wretched. This is something I've struggled with for a very long time. Again, never quite so concisely. I've always aimed for the latter, so I've sought absolution and felt wretched for it. I'm recognising now that you actually can't escape this conundrum by committing to either side of it. I think that the trick is to find balance in the grand scheme of things, to at times be unapologetically happy and at times to forgo your own happiness for the benefit of others, and of course as a method of keeping your ego in check. So again, this was something I think I can apply to my life. It's a tool, it's another tool in my toolkit. which the midsection of this book seemed to provide me with a lot of. The next quote, how could sincerity be a condition of friendship? A liking for truth at any cost is a passion that spares nothing and that nothing resists. It's a vice, at times a comfort or a selfishness. This is another notion that I've struggled with for a very long time. I sincerely dislike dishonesty, which sounds like an obvious thing, but it's not out of principle so much as I just don't like muddy waters. I like communication to be clear and concise, which is ironic given how much I'm waffling, I realise. I've sacrificed many friendships when it became apparent that people would prefer dishonesty to me offering what I believe to be reality. And I've always accepted the fault for that as my own, which I think is only fair. It's my grievance with dishonesty that causes the issue. For most, it's perfectly amiable to continue without addressing the truth between friends. And I definitely see it as a vice of mine. It's something that I actually take pleasure in, occasionally, telling unpleasant truths. Either out of spite or anger or a feeling of vengeance, I don't know. But sometimes I feel quite excited to be the one to throw the proverbial cat among the pigeons. It's almost like a proof of my intelligence or insight that I can see through the deceits that have been put in front of me. And that's something I need to personally work on, but I do kind of stand by the idea that personally I would prefer relationships and friendships that are built on an unusually large amount of honesty and communication. And while that may qualify me out of most friendships and lead me to a life of relative solitude, I can't really handle the tension of the alternative. It causes me a great discomfort, less than isolation usually does, to be in a situation where I can recognise deception and not address it. Another quote that reinforces a point from previously when they're travelling across the, I'm going to say Zwijde Zee, but I'm probably getting that completely wrong. So we are steaming along without any landmark. We can't gauge our speed. We are making progress and yet nothing is changing. It's not navigation but dreaming. Again, the desire for milestones and events, lest we feel our progress is non-existent. On occasion, it must be enough to recognise that the engines are running, and that despite the apparent stillness, there is motion, and that not all motion can be celebrated as vividly as a Sawyer's capsule landing back on Earth's surface. Sometimes the journey is uneventful and uninspiring, and at times it is downright tedious and infuriating, but that's just how things are. You have to have some faith in the realisation of your end goal, when the journey itself isn't providing you constant reassurance. Moreover, we cannot assert the innocence of anyone, whereas we can state with certainty the guilt of all. Every man testifies to the crime of all the others. That is my faith and my hope. Again, discussing the relativistic nature of guilt, and now the idea that through our own guilt and transgressions we act as witness to all of humanity's transgressions. It's a common theme that people project their insecurities and poor habits onto those around them, so even when protesting our innocence we often highlight our own shortcomings. The comment, "that is my faith and my hope," paints this in a positive light, to my mind deservedly so. I think the idea that regardless of how much we try to diminish our own role in wrongdoings, we cast a light on them, it means there's no sanctuary for guilt or shame, and to me that's a positive. It has a slightly darker subtext, that guilt and transgressions will likely always exist and they're kind of inescapable and kind of immutable, but as somebody who prefers things to be kind of clear and out in the open, I do like that our very nature leads us to expose our own transgressions when trying to expose other people's. And then kind of further to that, another quote, "Believe me, religions are on the wrong track the moment they moralise and fulminate commandments. God is not needed to create guilt or to punish. Our fellow men suffice, aided by ourselves." At this juncture in the story, there seems to begin a less subtle condemnation of religion, particularly its role in kind of assigning guilt and punishment, quite succinctly put here as an unnecessary and foolish venture. To me, this has always been an issue that I have with religion, and an indicator that religion is itself kind of a human construct, that we've extended our need to control and indict our fellow man and made it a divine process seems so transparently anthropological to me, that there's an unshakable feeling that behind every religious doctrine is the mind of a man, who, similar to the discussion above, projects his shortcomings onto the God he describes and defines. Why would a God be so petty as to judge his own creations? Somewhat furthered by a quote later on, thus the censor shapes aloud what he prescribes. There's an inherent foolishness in making clear that which you forbid, like you're issuing a challenge almost, or again, kind of publicly indicting yourself. And yeah, I see the reflection of this in every major religious text as an indicator that God isn't behind them. Isn't to say that they're completely dismissible, there's obviously a lot of good to be found in them, but it's the reason I consider myself an atheist or an agnostic, because none of the texts that have been provided seem distinct enough from humanity for me to believe there's anything special to them. Next quote. You see, a person I knew used to divide human beings into three categories: those who prefer having nothing to hide rather than being obliged to lie, those who prefer lying to having nothing to hide, and finally those who like both lying and the hidden. Again, another point that I just kind of found interesting, that had some personal relevance. I prefer to have nothing to hide than to be obliged to lie. I go to great lengths to maintain that. I will lie or omit the truth if telling it would harm somebody else, since that's not my decision to make. But personally, I try to remain an advocate of radical honesty. You know, truth in the face of personal embarrassment or upset, and truth at all opportunity. I acknowledge this isn't always possible. I'm certainly not claiming that I never lie, but I would like to think that I do my very best to at least be as honest as I can be. Again, it's almost a relative term. Recognising this behaviour as part of a tripartite system, I think will allow me to better understand the motives of others. I've always believed that everybody should want the same thing that I want, and I've known that's not true, but I've never seen it explained so, again, concisely, and again, it allows me to make something corporeal out of a thought that I've struggled with. So if this allows me to better interpret the motives of others, and in turn, kind of what they're likely to do in a given situation, it'll help me in scenarios where I've been recruited to kind of help avoid like a social disaster, I'll call it. Like knowing if somebody's a compulsive liar or compulsively honest, or somebody who, you know, tries to balance both, it's not insignificant when measuring social situations. Now my words have a purpose. They have the purpose, obviously, of silencing the laughter, of avoiding judgment personally, though there is apparently no escape. Is not the great thing that stands in the way of our escaping it the fact that we are the first to condemn ourselves? Therefore it is essential to begin by extending the condemnation to all, without distinction, in order to thin it out at the start. I think this represents another principle I try to stand by, the notion that judgment shouldn't be reserved for any one person or group, nor is anyone excluded from it. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I try to condemn everybody initially or to begin with, but I will consider kind of each action or opinion in isolation as well as in context before reaching a kind of conclusion and reacting to it. I don't allow somebody to perform actions I disagree with simply because they've extended kindness to me in the past, and nor do I dismiss everything said or done by anyone who has historically given me reason to distrust them. I try to assess everything in isolation as best I can and then factor in the rest and adjust my reaction accordingly. This includes myself, again. Finding a balance has been difficult, and until recently I believe the only way to truly free myself from the chains of hypocrisy was to be hypercritical of myself, so that I could never be accused of a double standard. I think recently I've become aware that for my own health I have to try and change that slightly. I have to change how I approach self-criticism so that I can live a happier and healthier life. It isn't healthy to be hypercritical of everything I do. But I would like to maintain as realistic a self-evaluation as possible, so where my integrity is challenged, I need to learn to either retract my opinion and remove myself from the discussion, or find a way to somehow express with enough eloquence and evidence why I believe myself to remain in a position to hold that opinion, in which I've placed myself above somebody else in whatever regard. I imagine this is a balance I'll never truly master, but I'm an idealist, and I'd sooner aim for the best possible reality and fall short than settle for something improper simply because I'm afraid of failure. And as for me, I pity without absolving. I understand without forgiving, and above all, I feel at last that I am being adored. Again, this is a very difficult balance that I personally struggle to find. I try to understand every side of a discussion, even those that are abhorrent to my personal views. I try to understand their origin and what has allowed them to reach their conclusions, because I believe it best equips me to try and challenge them. But also because, again, I acknowledge that depending on your surroundings or education and all these other cultural factors, nobody's right about everything. And as such, to dismiss somebody who holds an oppositional opinion as ignorant or hateful is a failure and indictment of my character and not theirs. That isn't to say that everybody can be convinced, and learning when to walk away because understanding has proven insufficient in offering an alternative route. It's important, again, for my own health to do just that, to walk away, to protect myself so that I may better rise to opportunities where I stand a higher chance of successfully progressing my goals. It's easy to despair, I think, in discussions against individuals with views that bring harm to others, because it seems like no amount of evidence or reasonable discussion will sway their opinion. Well, it kind of is a travesty to me that this is so. If your efforts can be best spent shifting the moderates closer towards yourself, shifting those with mildly intolerable views closer to moderacy, and eventually, in my case, the left, which is where I tend to find myself, then do that. Act where you're most impactful and accept that with time your actions will bring about significant change. I truly believe that, and in that sense the adoration for me comes from within. I want to be proud of my efforts, I want to feel like I've had an impact. I want to choose fights, avoiding those where I don't think I can make ground, and not be ashamed of that. I think, in fact, that choosing to instead be more efficacious is kind of admirable, and difficult, and worthy of some self-praise. There are lots of other messages kind of weaved throughout the book that I can't really bring together with a single quote, and so many that exist now in my mind as like a tangled mess as a result of it, that one day I'm sure I'll find explanations elsewhere in a manner that kind of gives them that manifestation, like how I've discussed some of these passages have done. I'd highly recommend the book to anybody with an interest in good storytelling and philosophy. Camus has a fantastic writing style, makes it a real joy to kind of read his work. I fully intend to explore the rest of his writings, and if anybody is remotely interested, I'll be sure to highlight passages as I do, so that I may repeat this sort of commentary for those too. I guess all that leaves me to say is cheers, thanks for watching, maybe leave a comment below or like this video, just to let me know there's some interest. And again, I'll gladly welcome any discussion at all, so please ask questions, poke holes in my lines of thinking. I know of no better way to be educated than through active discourse. Thanks again. Catch you next time. Mic test, mic test. Okay, we're good. Test, 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 test. This is me speaking, this is my voice, this is my speaking, this is me saying. Feel Poberio, feel Poberio, feel Poberio, feel Poberio, feel Poberio, alle voila. Feel Poberio, feel Poberio, feel Poberio, alle voila. Oh, the angel from my nightmares. Oh, Lord. That's fine. I don't need that there. That's good. Oh. Wub, 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 Should I set my phone up as a second camera? Action shots, action shots, action shots. I'm not going to do that, obviously. Hey, he's in Blackwood, Wales too. Hello there. Hello there. Hello there. Hello there. I don't think I have a good side. No, let's just go with no. I'm not going to try and make a joke here. This might make a blooper, it might not. Should you do bloopers on what's meant to be like a review of a philosophy book? Am I belittling my material? Is anyone going to watch it, or do I care as well make it funny? Look at my cleverness, there is a wall on which I can put the quotes for you to read. Fuck my life, am I really going to fuck this up every time? I would like to know how to pronounce his name. Albert Camus. Lemonade. Oh, ice cold squelch. Hark at thee, Albert Camus. I don't know what that was. Actually, I do. Yeah. Anyway, start again. Good God.